the Secret Service's job famously to be prepared to take a bullet for the president, but it now seems to be the Secretary of State's job to be prepared to take a surface-to-air missile for the president.
This week, there's only really one story that has been dominating the conversations of the White House press corps, which is effectively what happened on the plane back from NATO in Turkey. The Washington Post first, and this is something I talked about on the radio this week, uncovered details, and other US papers have since joined in, of the fact that Trump had initially flown, and this was known, he had flown to the NATO summit on his new Air Force One, which was a gift from the Qatari government. They had then decided that he would fly back on the old Air Force One due to security reasons, and there was talk of an Iranian plot to get him. But what we didn't know until this week was he didn't actually get on the old Air Force One, or maybe he got on it very briefly. He did not fly from Turkey on it. He snuck through a catering trolley, which he hid in, onto a smaller Air Force One, and then changed back at Mildenhall in England when they did their stop before getting off the plane in DC and acting like things were normal. Now, White House press corps, some White House aides didn't know he wasn't on the plane. And Jerry, I think it speaks to a few things, but I suppose first off, let's talk about the act itself, and then where we are really with Iran.
It's just such an arresting story, this idea of the President of the United States, boarding a plane and then immediately going off in a catering truck on the out the other side in a rather undignified way. Look, I think some of that is a little bit overdone. Presidents do have to basically they don't have to, but they do follow the advice of the Secret Service. This clearly was a serious threat, supposedly. It does, of course, raise the question of whether or not everybody else on that, as you say, that old Air Force One that was rolled in, whether everybody else was basically a decoy. Because if that plane was apparently not secure enough to withstand the threat of what I understand was a sort of surface-to-air missile threat coming out of Turkey, then it means that everybody on that plane were acting as were the decoy plane, and presumably expendable, which included obviously large numbers of the White House press corps, significant numbers of White House staff, including senior staff, including, by the way, I think I'm right in saying, Katy, Marco Rubio.
Yeah, Marco Rubio was on the what we might call the decoy plane.
Exactly. So it's the Secret Service's job famously to be prepared to take a bullet for the president, but it now seems to be the Secretary of State's job to be prepared to take a surface-to-air missile for the president. So, look, I think it can be a little bit overdone. It's not surprising that when the White House press corps were used as a decoy that it gets a lot of attention. But in terms of the actual operation, I think, amusing as all the spectacle is, and as sort of arresting as the idea that these people were used as decoys is, this is not a completely unreasonable thing to do. I mean, on Iran, I think the large question, as you say, Casey, and we don't need to dwell too much on, the Iran, we've talked a lot about it, but it just shows again, it does. I think the larger image here is of a president who is, frankly being sort of humiliated by Iran. I mean, here he is. Not only is he failing to achieve his objectives in the war, and there's no evidence that he's doing that, and Iran still seems to have the upper hand over things like the Strait of Hormuz. But they're forcing him to take rather, embarrassing and
hiding catering trolleys,
embarrassing evasive measures.
Yeah, I think it adds to the sense that he is not in control and is not over in the way he wants to be. I mean, there've always been threats, on Donald Trump's side from the Iranians, we've heard, and the Iranians will also put out these, they put one out recently saying, we want to assassinate Melania Trump. And I think some in the White House will be a bit like, the press shouldn't be giving all this stuff attention. They will say, we get these death threats all the time. It's nothing new from the Iranians. But of course, when you're in the middle of a war that isn't going away, despite the president's best efforts to find that off-ramp, I think people, obviously, all these things have more significance and probably are taken more seriously as a result of it. And then I think just the other factor is, this week, you had Trump in one of his very brief phone interviews saying that he is low-keying it on Iran. And you also have the energy secretary claiming that oil is up to, pre-Strait of Hormuz going wrong heights. So that is being questioned. But I think just going into the summer, the fact that, reports of Trump frustrated at the number of missiles or the lack thereof, it just feels a bit as though he's trying to find a way to put the war on the back burner without actually having much to show for it.
Yeah, it looks like they've shifted to a sort of an economic warfare strategy in the last week or two. Just the constant threats of annihilating Iran and its infrastructure and everything else, and raining down fire and fury seem to have been replaced by what might ultimately may have a better chance of success, which is maintaining the blockade, keeping Iran from exporting its oil and other products, putting the economic pressure on that way, in the hope that Iran will be brought to the negotiating table and agree to do the things the US wants. I remain a little skeptical about that. This is not a regime that seems to care too much about the plight of its people, as long as it's able to continue to get supply, presumably from Russia and China, with whatever it needs to keep itself, its defense capabilities strong, to keep itself in power. And I think, the idea that it's going to sort of surrender just because, it's costly, its standard of the people's standard of living has dropped sharply, I think is a bit of a long shot.
And just finally, Jerry, data centers. Something I wrote about in the Sunday Times just gone is how a revolt is brewing when it comes to data centers. And to me, it seems one which the White House is either not caught up with or doesn't really think it's a big enough problem. What we've seen across America, of course, is the rise of data centers. There are different figures as to how many, but a rough estimate would be 4,000. When it comes to the AI revolution, there'll be a lot more to come. But you look at some of the candidates who have won recently in primaries. So Abdel El-Sayed in Michigan, for example, made data centers a really big part of it. You've got Republicans on the ground who are also Vivek Ramaswamy in Ohio, the Republican candidate, who are also coming up with their own policies on data centers. And then you have the White House that has ultimately promised to try and cut red tape, environmental concerns to allow as many as possible. And Trump last week dismissing some of the criticism. Even the Texas governor's now paused some of the work on data centers. And Trump saying they're effectively beautiful buildings and they're going to be the next oil. So everyone should have effectively stopped going on about them and get behind them. Jerry, do you think this is a problem to come?
I do. I mean, as you point out, and you pointed out this week, Katie, that this is a bipartisan issue. As you mentioned, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, has promised to limit significantly the building of these massive hyperscale data centers in Texas. The governor of New York here, Kathy Hochul, imposed the first statewide moratorium on the building of these large data centers. This is, something like 75% of Americans say they don't like these things. They don't want. It's partly NIMBYism, of course. People don't want these things, anywhere near them in their neighborhood. But they do also they do represent a significant drain on energy resources. Now, many of these companies are building their own power plants too, but they are seen as a threat to the economic sustainability of many states here. I think two things. One, I think this is part of a larger revolt. Revolt's the wrong word, but a larger unease about AI, and everybody knows that AI is developing at an extraordinary pace, and most people probably think it's going to put them out of a job and completely upend their lives, and they're probably right about that, at least in the short term. And these data centers are a very tangible way of sort of pushing back against that. I also think, Katie, that there's a much larger thing going on. Americans are very unhappy with the state of the economy. They're very unhappy with the state of the country. 2/3 of them say the country's on the wrong track. Very large numbers, this links back to our conversation about socialism, very large numbers of them say capitalism isn't working. And I think part of what it is that they're partly right about this, that American capitalism has become dominated by these huge corporations. Every major sector in the US economy is dominated by a handful of companies. You have these oligopolies. People feel increasingly kind of powerless and increasingly frustrated at this massive, and by the way, these companies have cozy relationships with the government. They spend huge amounts of money backing candidates. They have very, very expensive lobbying operations. Rules are made largely on their behalf. At least that's how it seems. And then they come along and want to build these massive, massive plants, data centers all across the country. And I think people are just tired of being of this sort of feeling of helplessness and this feeling of smallness in the face of this enormous this political business nexus between these incredibly powerful, incredibly wealthy people who run these companies and the government that basically does their bidding. And I think it's I think it's quite an important sort of political development.
Yeah, and Trump at the center of it in the way that he has, well, the tech bros at first went to kiss the ring, but he has accepted that gladly, and therefore there does seem to be in this second term the sense that what is good for Silicon Valley is good for America and good for Trump, and which again is just adding to that sense.